Last Tuesday was a big moment for the American left. That was with Abdul El-Sayed, of course, winning the Michigan Senate primary for the Democrats, proving the left can win nominations in purple states and they can take on and defeat the money of the Israel lobby. And polls had suggested the Democratic Socialists of America would due another win this week in Wisconsin. Their member, Franchesca Hong, had been the frontrunner in a primary for the governorship of the state. Polls had shown her 20 points ahead of her nearest rival. But by Wednesday morning, it was clear she'd lost, even if by the narrowest of margins. With almost all votes counted, the establishment-backed Democrat David Crowley has 39.78% of the vote. Hong has 39.37% of the vote. Hong, who is a chef and restaurant owner, was dogged by negative stories about past tweets calling for the abolition of the police and even cancelling Thanksgiving, which she, of course, struggled to rebut or even explain. This was one viral clip during the campaign.
You know, you talked about your past positions that he keeps highlighting and, obviously likely would continue to do so before November should you win. One thing that they brought up as well was a post from you in 2021 where you said Americans should cancel Thanksgiving, should have done this in 1621. The post has been deleted. Republicans have been highlighting it. Do you still believe that Thanksgiving should be canceled?
I'm a chef. And one of the first meals that I made that was for the community when I was 16 was a Thanksgiving meal. I always think my hospitality background in owning a restaurant for 7-8 years, that bringing folks around the table to share conversation and build community is always a good thing. But Thanksgiving is also a time that's incredibly painful for many people in our communities. And so I think I wanted to make sure that people understood that there are multiple views, but views can evolve. And the position that I'm running for right now, and I think my background as a chef, will actually help me become a better governor that's able to bring more people to the table.
I don't think anything she said there was actually unreasonable. I don't agree with all of it, but it's not unreasonable. These are coherent points. But it's not great populist politics, which is perhaps why Bernie Sanders and AOC withheld any endorsement of Hong, which is a shame. It's a shame. You said one thing in the winter of 2020. We were kind of all going a bit crazy, and you don't win, which is a shame. She probably would have been a very good public representative. But the closeness of the race means there has been some backlash at the decision of those two, namely Bernie Sanders and AOC, to stay out of the race. Nathan Robinson is editor of the Leftist Current Affairs magazine. He said this: "Totally inexcusable that Bernie and AOC failed to back Hong. If she loses narrowly, it will be a major setback for the socialist movement that they will bear major responsibility for." Someone with a different take on why Hong lost was Julian Andreoni from Dropsite News. "Americans love economic populism. They want another New Deal, but they are completely turned off by college campus culture warrior performative activism. Evidence? These results happened in almost neighboring states on the same night." Andreoni is comparing Hong's loss in the Wisconsin primary to a win in the Minnesota Senate primary by Peggy Flanagan. Flanagan ran on progressive priorities, including universal health care, a high minimum wage, and an end to unconditional US aid for Israel. These were all very popular things, particularly with undecided voters. She was also massively outspent by a corporate-backed rival. Flanagan was backed by Bernie Sanders, but she does not identify as a socialist and was not backed by the DSA. Here's how she accepted the Democratic nomination.
"As your next senator, here are the things that I'm ready to throw down for. Ending the despicable priorities of an administration that hands out tax breaks to billionaires, builds gilded ballrooms, and spends billions on bombs while screwing over working people. Truly affordable housing so that people can pay their rent and young people can buy their first home before they're middle-aged. Passing right to repair so that Minnesota farmers can fix their own damn equipment. And getting rid of prior authorization so that some dude behind a desk, or worse yet, an AI bot, isn't determining whether you get the life-saving health care that your doctor has prescribed. And passing Medicare for all because we are going to make healthcare available and affordable once and for all.
She doesn't identify as a socialist. That's winning, by the way. When people talk about policies far to the left of the Democrats, then at any point before 2016, not including the New Deal, obviously, and they say, look, I'm not a socialist. I just want to put working people first. I want to stop tax cuts for billionaires. I want to stop support for Israel. I want to build homes for working people. But I'm not a socialist. Fine. Knock yourself out. That's winning. When people do everything you want in your agenda, that sounds like Bernie Sanders. But I'm not a socialist. That's fine. And by the way, before people in the comments say, what is social democracy? I know. But clearly the tenor, the tone, the rhetoric, that is fire and brimstone left-wing politics. If she doesn't want to identify as that, great. Fine by me. To get a lowdown on Tuesday's primaries and what they meant for the American left, earlier on today, my colleague Michael Walker spoke to Branco Marcetic. He's, of course, a staff writer at the magazine Jacobin.
I think there was one major race that was a very bitter, disappointing loss, which is the gubernatorial race in Wisconsin. I mean, that really was, the biggest prize for socialists because it was a statewide race in the Midwest. Socialists wanted to prove that they could win in the Midwestern state on the state level. And it would have been an electoral test for the socialist movement in the general election. So that was really the biggest prize, and that's a massive disappointment. Is it an overall defeat? I think it's hard to make that case if you look at the candidates that DSA chapters, Democratic Socialists of America chapters actually endorsed. Most of them did end up moving on to the general election and winning their races. Now, those I don't think eclipse the Fran Hong defeat, but it is important, I think, to keep it into perspective that on the whole, socialist candidates did end up winning last night.
Also, just to clarify, because I know I've very much familiar with Hong and Flanagan. What are the DSA-backed or sort of DSA candidates who did win last night? What kind of races are we talking about there?
There were several incumbents that won re-election. Ryan Clancy, for instance, in Wisconsin. He's in the state assembly. There was also Omar Fateh, which, he had run for mayor of Minneapolis. He won his state Senate re-election bid. But there were also others that won. I mean, in Minnesota, for instance, the school board race, Twin Cities DSA endorsed candidate won for that position. You had a socialist candidate actually two socialist candidates running to replace Fran Hong in her current seat. One was a DSA-backed socialist candidate, Juliana Bennett. She lost to another socialist candidate. And I also have confirmed from Ryan Clancy, who I just mentioned before, that the Wisconsin Legislative Socialist Caucus, which did not exist 4 years ago, and the last time it existed was about 100 years ago, is going to expand in the next legislative session, partly because of, some of the wins that I mentioned, but also partly because I think some members are going to join that caucus who were not identifying as socialists before. And then sort of a few other kind of smaller races down ballot that were won by socialist candidates. Also, I'll be remiss to not mention in Connecticut and Vermont, which also had primaries, there were several socialist candidates that won, including one for the Connecticut State Senate, I believe, the first Muslim candidate that will sit in that body. So there are some other major wins, if we look beyond that one kind of very disappointing defeat.
So you got some local victories alongside the sort of nationwide defeat, or I suppose this is a statewide defeat, but it would be to go to a nationwide body. What happened with Hong then? I mean, there's been some fallout today. I've sort of seen it on X. People arguing whether or not Bernie and AOC have let down the socialist cause by not backing Franchesca Hong. I mean, obviously people on the other side saying that they made the right decision because she was a weak candidate. This is what they're saying. She was a weak candidate and she probably would have lost in the generals, and that would have been more damaging for socialists than her losing the primary. Where do you stand on that?
I think it's a fair criticism. I mean, Hong lost by a few thousand votes. I think it was 0.4%. So, if Sanders and AOC, and not just those two, I mean, the entire kind of slate of recent socialist candidates who went to campaign for Abdul El-Sayed in Michigan just last week, they stayed away from the race. And I think that reflects some of the internal doubts within the left about, Hong as a candidate. I think a lot of people were kind of wanting to see if she would be able to get through this primary before they kind of stepped in and wanted to lend their names to her campaign. But at the same time, such hesitancy can also become a self-fulfilling prophecy. And it could be that by staying away from the race, they may have ended up kind of securing a defeat for her. I think also, before we get too hung up on these endorsements, we don't know if these endorsements would have made a difference. There's also other factors that played a role in this. I mean, one was, again, Hong, the socialist candidate, was way outspent by the kind of Democratic Party establishment. Her campaign was really running on fumes. It wasn't very well funded. I think they spent something like $500,000 or less than $500,000 on ads, whereas Crowley, the candidate who ended up winning, the forces behind him spent about $4 million. So it wasn't as dramatic a overspending ratio compared to the Michigan race, so that one really was an outlier in terms of just how much money was being poured. But they were significantly outspent. There were also, internal mistakes that the Hong campaign made, arguably mistakes. I mean, for instance, Hong was the only candidate who did not spend a single cent on TV advertising. And she, I think that was the strategy, was we're going to try and focus on the voters that we need to turn out, that we know are going to be enthused about our campaign. But it could be argued that, in that final stretch, as the establishment was kind of really attacking her, and as they spent big on these ads that were kind of calling into question her electability, putting some money towards television advertising herself to kind of reach some of these voters and allay their fears may have helped to combat this. And I think other people have pointed out that Hong didn't really go on the attack, whereas in the final stretch, they really were hammering her for some of these electability concerns. And, there have been questions raised about, could Hong have been a little more nimble and skilled in kind of dealing with some of these questions that were being raised about these old tweets and so on and so forth. With every campaign, there are a million things I think that you can point to. But I think, in terms of what the campaign itself could have controlled, those are things that should be looked at, and reflected on in the months ahead, besides just the kind of Sanders and AOC and so on, not jumping in.
And another analysis I've seen online today from a bunch of people is to say Peggy Flanagan, who has become the Senate candidate in Minnesota. She's a sort of economic populist. She wants Medicare for all. She wants to rein in the power of the billionaires. But she hasn't got the same sort of history of saying abolish the police or cancel Halloween. And that shows actually the way to victory, which is economic populism without the kind of cultural stuff that many people find alienating or weird. And I suppose this feeds in really, doesn't it, to AOC saying woke one was crazy. So how does this result feed into that particular debate about whether or not economic populists should ditch the cultural stuff?
I mean, I think that the defund slogan, for instance, that one has been problematic. Obviously it made sense at the time, but there has been an effort by socialist candidates since then to kind of reframe how they how they talk about this issue. I mean, actually, polling and even elections show that the public is in favor of diverting funding towards sort of more less punitive kind of and alternatives to policing. Basically, people who are first responders who aren't police, who aren't armed, mental health professionals, and so on and so forth. We have seen that actually be an electoral winner in certain parts of the country. I think the fact that you see people like Hong and Al Sayed kind of, and Zara Mamdani too, kind of backing away from some of these issues, I think reflects acknowledgement that this is not necessarily the most electorally viable thing. And I mean, when it comes to some of the more cultural stuff, some of the things that Hong really became controversial for, hating on holidays, public holidays, and talking about race in these very kind of specific kind of campus-oriented ways. I think that stuff has really been widely acknowledged as pretty toxic and alienating. I think that's an outgrowth of where the left was in this long period of wilderness in the first part of the 21st century. And I think there's an understanding that to really be able to meet people where they are, that kind of stuff has to be left behind. I think with Flanagan, we should also mention, Flanagan was kind of a more establishment candidate, even though she did have these policy positions that overlap with the left. She was the lieutenant governor. So she was someone who was more of a well-known quantity in the state, and was able to kind of balance those progressive positions while kind of having the auspices of being a sort of more establishment-backed candidate.
Super interesting conversation between Michael and Branco. He does great work. Jacobin does great work. There is so much interesting media right now in the States. We've just cited, of course, Drop Site News a little bit earlier in the story. There's Jacobin 2, other publications as well. Just coming from the left and helping to redefine the terms of what's just a credible political conversation, which is really distilled with someone like Peggy Flanagan, right? They have the agenda of the radical left in the US, of the DSA, without being in the DSA. Great. And I do think there's a learning there in terms of these two different politicians, Peggy Flanagan and Hong, and why one did well and one underwhelmed, right? I think it's pretty instructive. I agree it's actually quite straightforward as to why that happened. At the same time, I think Hong is 37 now, so they were 31 when they were saying that stuff. I'm 42, so that's a baby, of course. But, people can say slightly strange or incoherent things during a COVID lockdown. I don't think that should disqualify them from ever standing for public office. But you know what? She's young. She can stand again. But that stuff just isn't very popular. As my colleague Michael Walker has said many, many times, it's just not popular with the median voter. And that's fine. You're allowed to think it. You might even be right. Michael Walker might be wrong. But if you want to win public office, you can't really say that. Does that mean that, more people in prison is a good idea? I think Britain, for instance, has too many people in prison. I think America certainly has too many people in prison. What are the solutions is, of course, the point, right? That's what you're then meant to discuss. But these kind of huge statements that are just sort of put out on social media, again, fine if you want to do it. But if you also want to win public office, it's probably going to hold you back.